The bread was burning, and Ruth Calloway was the only one who noticed. She pulled the pan from the oven with a folded rag, set it on the cooling board, and turned back to the sink without a word. The men at the long table went on talking. About the price of cattle, about the dry spell that had cracked the eastern fields, about a man named Decker who had lost 3 horses to a river crossing gone wrong. Not one of them looked up. Not one of them had looked up in the 3 weeks since she'd arrived at the Hargrove Station. That was all right. Ruth had stopped expecting to be looked at a long time ago. She had come to the station the way a leaf comes to rest against a fence post, not by intention, but by exhaustion. Her mother had died in October, 2 days after the first hard frost. And the house in Milford had gone to her mother's creditors before the ground was even thawed enough to dig the grave. Ruth had packed what she could carry: a wool coat, a change of dress, her mother's Bible with the cracked spine, and had taken the stage west because west was the direction the coach was already going, and she had not had the will to argue with it. The Hargrove Station was a way station and working ranch both, owned by a man named Mr. Aldous Whitmore, who was 63 years old, walked with a cane on cold mornings, and ran the place with the quiet authority of someone who had long since stopped needing to raise his voice. He had hired Ruth on the spot when she stepped off the coach. Not out of kindness, she understood, but because his last cook had left without notice, and there were 12 working men who needed feeding twice a day. She cooked, she swept, she mended what needed mending. She did not talk at supper, and no one talked to her. The men called her the cook when they referred to her at all. Most of the time they did not refer to her at all. Ruth Calloway had become a ghost before she was 30 years old, and she had begun, in those pale mornings at the stove, to wonder if she had always been one. The man who would change that arrived on a Thursday near the end of November, when the sky had gone the color of pewter and the wind came off the open plain in long, flat gusts that found every gap in the station's plank walls. His name was Cass Dillard. She heard him before she saw him. A single knock at the door, firm and unhurried, like someone who was accustomed to waiting to be let in, but not accustomed to knocking twice. Mr. Whitmore went to the door himself, which he rarely did, and when Ruth glanced up from the bread dough she was turning, she saw a tall man in a dust-colored coat step inside and remove his hat in one motion. The way men do when removing a hat is something they do out of genuine respect rather than habit. He was not young. His face had been worked over by sun and wind, until it had taken on the quality of old saddle leather, brown and creased around the eyes, harder at the jaw than it had probably once been. His hair was dark with threads of gray at the temples. He moved through the room, with the economy of someone who had learned, through long practice, not to waste effort. She looked away before he could catch her looking. He was a hired hand, she gathered from the conversation. A ranch manager or something close to it, recommended by a man Mr. Whitmore trusted. He would be staying through winter and into spring to help bring order to the east pastures, which had been poorly managed since the previous foreman had gone. Mr. Whitmore showed him where he'd be sleeping. The other men hardly glanced up from their game of cards. Ruth slid the bread back into the oven and said nothing. He came to breakfast the next morning, after everyone else had sat down, which meant the biscuits had already been passed around twice, and the pot of coffee was 2/3 empty. He took the last open seat at the far end of the table, poured himself what remained in the pot, and picked up the one biscuit left on the plate. He bit into it. He chewed slowly. He looked at the biscuit. "Who made these?" he asked. The question landed in a gap in the conversation, loud the way quiet things are loud when they arrive in a room that isn't expecting them. Hob Yancey, who sat nearest him, shrugged without looking up. "The cook, I reckon." Cass Dillard looked down the length of the table and then across to where Ruth stood at the stove, her back half turned, pretending she hadn't heard. "They're very good," he said. He did not say it loudly. He did not say it to impress anyone. He said it the way a man states a fact he expects will be recorded somewhere, even if no one present is writing it down. The conversation at the table moved on. Someone made a joke about Hobbs' card playing. Someone else pushed back his chair. In 20 seconds it was as though nothing had been said at all. But Ruth had heard it. She had been cooking at the Hargrove Station for 22 days, and it was the first time anyone had said that the food was good. She kept her face turned toward the stove. She did not trust what it might show. He did not make a habit of compliments. That was the thing she noticed first, that it had not been a performance. In the days that followed, Cass Dillard said very little at meals, asked for nothing that wasn't in front of him, and ate with the focused attention of a man who had spent many years eating alone and had learned to take the practice seriously. But sometimes, not always, he would say something. Not to her exactly, not looking at her, just out into the air of the room, aimed at nothing in particular. "Good stew." 2 words said to his spoon. Or, on a morning when she had made Johnny cake with what little cornmeal remained. "Didn't expect that today." And there was something in the way he said it that was not complaint and not flattery, but a kind of honest surprise. The way a man sounds when the world has managed to offer him something he hadn't planned on. She didn't understand, at first, why it unsettled her so much. She had spent the last several years learning to live without being noticed, and she had been, if not content, at least accustomed to it. There was a kind of safety in invisibility. People couldn't hurt what they couldn't see. But Cass Dillard saw her, not intrusively, not the way the men at her previous employer's house had looked at her, taking a quick inventory before losing interest. He saw her the way you see something you're quietly trying to understand. It frightened her a little, if she was honest. She wasn't used to being in focus. The handle on the wood box broke in the first week of December. It was a small thing, a worn iron fitting that had been failing for months, probably, until finally it gave way one morning when Ruth lifted the box to carry it to the hearth. The box lurched, caught itself on the edge of the floor, and didn't spill, but the handle hung useless from one remaining bolt. She reported it to Mr. Whitmore, who said he'd see to it, and then didn't, because he had 17 other things that wanted seeing to, and the wood box was, at the end of the day, still functional if you carried it from the bottom with both hands. Ruth carried it from the bottom with both hands. It was heavy and awkward, and she did it 4 times a day. She didn't complain. Complaining had never done her much good. One morning she came into the kitchen from the cold to find the wood box sitting in its usual spot, but different. The handle had been replaced. Not with the same worn fitting, but with a new bracket, screwed cleanly and squarely into the wood, the iron still shiny from the forge. Whoever had done it had also sanded the rough edge on the side of the box that she had been catching her knuckle against for weeks. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. She had not told anyone about the knuckle. When she glanced out toward the barn, she could see Cass Dillard crossing the yard with his back to her, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He did not look back. He did not wait to be thanked. Ruth set her hand on the new handle and let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Then she turned and began cutting the biscuit dough, because there were 12 men to feed and the morning wasn't going to wait. "You don't talk much at supper," he said. He had come to the kitchen late, on a Sunday evening, past 9, when the dishes were done, and the other men had gone to their bunks. She was sitting at the table, near the lamp, working a split in the sole of one of her shoes with a length of thread she'd waxed with a candle stub. She had not heard him come in. "Mr. Dillard," she said, which was not exactly an answer. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then came inside and sat down at the far end of the table without asking permission. That was not rudeness, she understood. That was just the way he moved through spaces. Like he had a right to be in them without needing to announce it. "I don't mean it as a criticism," he said. "Plenty of people talk too much." She kept her eyes on the shoe. "I don't have much to say that they'd want to hear." He considered that. He was quiet for a while, and the quiet was not uncomfortable in the way silences usually were for her. That edgy expectation that someone would say something to fill it with, usually something she didn't want. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 5 weeks. Before this, Milford. I had a..." She stopped, recalibrated. "I came from Milford." He did not press. She appreciated that more than she could have said. "I came from a place called Harlan's Fork," he said after a moment. "Before this, and before that, 2 other outfits I won't bore you with." He looked down at his hands, which were folded on the table, broad and dark from years of outdoor work. "I've been moving a long time. Don't you want to stop?" The question came out before she'd decided to ask it. She felt her face go warm. "I'm sorry. That's not my business." "No," he said. "It's a fair question." He was quiet again. "I suppose I keep thinking I'll know the place when I come to it. So far I haven't." Ruth looked at him for a moment, really looked, the first time she'd allowed herself to, and then looked back at her shoe. "I know that feeling," she said. She hadn't meant to say that either, but it hung there between them, honest and small, and he received it without doing anything that would make it into something it wasn't. He didn't fill it with assurances. He didn't deflect it. He just let it be what it was. They sat like that for a while, the lamp burning between them, the wind pressing at the walls. After a time he said good night and left. She listened to his footsteps cross the floor and go. She sat for a while longer, the shoe in her lap, the thread still in her hand, and noticed for the first time in longer than she could remember that the room felt less empty than it had before. She began to expect him. That was the danger, and she knew it even as it was happening. He did not come to the kitchen every night, only some nights, when the other men had retired, and the station was quiet, and the work of the day was finished. He would sit at the far end of the table, with a mug of whatever she had on the stove, and they would talk. Or they would not talk, and both things were equally comfortable, in a way that nothing had been comfortable for her in a very long time. He told her about a horse he had once trained that had been afraid of its own shadow until the day it wasn't, and he still didn't know what had changed. She told him about her mother's garden, the way the sweet peas came back every year without being asked to, long after you'd given up expecting them. He listened the way careful people listen, not waiting for a gap to put his own words into, but actually hearing what she said and holding it for a moment before responding. It was rare enough that she sometimes stopped mid-sentence just to check that he was still there. He always was, but she was careful. She had been burned before by the mistake of thinking that kindness was permanent, that a man who treated you well on Thursday would still be treating you well by Sunday. She had learned that lesson twice, and she had no intention of learning it a third time. She kept one part of herself at a remove, watchful, the way you watch the weather on a day that can't decide what it wants to do. If he noticed the wall she kept up, he gave no sign. He did not push at it. He just kept showing up, steady as a post, and saying what he said, and doing what he did. The roof above the kitchen window had a gap in it where the flashing had failed. When the rain came, water ran down the inside of the wall and pooled on the floor below the sill. Ruth had put a pot there and emptied it as needed, and not said anything. Because the list of things that needed doing around the station was long, and her name was at the bottom of any consideration. One morning in January, she came into the kitchen to find that the gap had been patched. The flashing was new. The inside wall had been wiped clean of the water stain, as far up as a man's arm could reach, which was considerable. There were shavings on the kitchen floor that hadn't been swept out yet, pine shavings from a plane, still fragrant. She looked at them. She swept them up. She didn't say anything at supper, because there was no opening for it, and because she understood, by now, that he hadn't done it for the occasion of being thanked. That evening, when he came in and settled at the end of the table, she set a mug of coffee in front of him and stood for a moment with the pot in her hand. "The roof doesn't leak anymore," she said. He looked at the mug. No, it was an easy fix. It had not been an easy fix. It had required someone to climb to the roof in January cold with tools and new metal and spend the better part of a morning doing it. She knew this because she had heard him up there. The careful steps, the sound of work. "Mr. Dillard," she said. He looked up. She wanted to say something equal to what he had done, something that would carry the weight of it without being mawkish about it. She turned the words over in her mind and found that none of them were adequate. "Thank you," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, just a moment. But it was the longest he had done it, the most direct, and she didn't look away from it. "You're welcome, Miss Calloway," he said. February was hard. A storm came in off the plains that lasted 4 days and kept everyone penned inside. The wood supply ran low on the 3rd day, and by the 4th morning the kitchen was the warmest room in the station, and men drifted in throughout the day on one pretext or another, pulling chairs close to the stove and staying longer than they needed to. It made the space feel different. Ruth moved through it carefully, keeping to her work, stepping around men who occupied the space, without appearing to notice they were doing so. On the evening of the 4th day, when the storm had finally quit, and the world outside was white and still, she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark field and felt the particular exhaustion of having been around people all day without ever once feeling less alone. "You look tired," said a voice behind her. She turned. Cass Dillard was in the doorway, the last of the men to have drifted through. The others had gone back to their room now that the stove in the bunkhouse was stoked again. "I'm fine," she said. He came in anyway and leaned against the wall near the window, arms crossed. He didn't look at her directly. He looked out at the snow. 4 days is a long time to be crowded," he said. "They weren't bothering me. I didn't say they were." She turned back to the window. Outside, the snow caught the lamplight and held it. "My mother used to say the worst thing about hard weather wasn't the cold," Ruth said. She hadn't planned to say it. It was how it made you realize how small your world actually was. She waited for him to say something about how small worlds weren't necessarily bad, or how she'd find her footing, or one of the other things people said when they wanted to be kind but didn't know how to sit inside someone else's difficulty without moving around it. He didn't say any of those things. "She sounds like she understood things," he said. Ruth felt the back of her throat tighten in a way she didn't expect. "She did," she said. "She understood most things. I'm not sure I was paying close enough attention while she was here." Silence. The kind that wasn't asking her to fill it. "I don't think we're built to pay attention to the things we love while we have them," he said. "That's not a failing. It's just how we're made." She looked at him then. He was still looking out at the snow, his face profile to her, jaw set in that way it had, and she thought that whatever he was saying he had earned through his own private losses, and that he had not shared them with her, and perhaps never would, and that she found she didn't need him to. She had been around people her whole life who had told her exactly who they were and disappointed her exactly as promised. Here was a man who had said almost nothing and shown her everything she needed to know. "Thank you," she said, for the second time. For something she couldn't fully name. He turned from the window and looked at her, and the lamp between them made the angles of his face easier to read, and what she read there was not pity and was not performance. "You don't have to keep thanking me, Miss Calloway," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to." Something shifted in the line of his expression, not a smile, quite, but the precursor to one, the thing a smile comes from. He said good night and went. She listened to the door close behind him. Spring came slowly that year, the way springs do when winter has been mean. The snow left in patches, grudging. The fields showed green in tentative lines along the low places where the melt collected. The men moved outside again, and the station resumed its usual rhythms. And Ruth cooked and swept and mended and did not yet know what to make of what had quietly become the center of her days. She was setting the supper table in the last week of March when Mr. Whitmore appeared in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand, which meant something had either happened or was about to. "Miss Calloway," he said, "sit down a moment if you would." She sat. He told her that his daughter had written from Denver. She was coming to take over the running of the station. Mr. Whitmore's hip was getting worse, and the decision had been made, and Ruth's position as cook would no longer be needed after May. He said it kindly. He gave her 2 months' wages ahead of time, which she had not expected and could not refuse. He said she'd have a good reference from him, which he probably meant. After he left, she sat at the kitchen table for a while with the coins on the wood in front of her and tried to make a plan, the way she had taught herself to do. One thing at a time. Start with what's real and work outward. What was real was this. She had a little money, no family, and no particular place to go. The stage went south on Wednesdays. She could be in Coburn by Friday, and Coburn was a large enough town that there might be something available. She could. She had done harder things. She wrapped the coins in her handkerchief and put them in her coat pocket and went to start the bread. She had not told Cass Dillard. She didn't know why exactly. The evenings went on the way they had. The lamp on the table, the coffee, the quiet. And she found that she could not bring herself to say it, partly because she didn't want to see his face rearrange itself into the expression people make when a problem resolves itself conveniently, and partly because something in her chest went small and tight when she thought about it, and she didn't want to examine that too closely. He found out from Hob Yancey? She could tell, because he came in that evening earlier than usual and sat down without pouring himself any coffee and looked at the table. Whitmore told the men, he said. I expected he would. When? May. She kept her back to him, measuring out the next morning's oats. I've been thinking about Coburn. There's a hotel there that might need. I want to ask you something, he said. The directness of it made her stop. She turned. He was looking at her with the same quality of attention he had always given her. Focused and unhurried and entirely serious. Except that now there was something else in it. Something closer to the surface than he usually allowed. I've been writing to a man named Fletcher Boone in Archer County, he said. He runs a cattle operation, mid-size, well-managed. He wants someone to manage the northwest section, 300 acres and a herd he's built up over 8 years. He paused. I've been offered the position. I've been thinking for some time about whether to take it. Ruth waited. The house on that section has 2 rooms, he said. It was built for a family. The room was very quiet. Outside, a night bird called once and did not repeat itself. Cass, she said. It was the first time she had used his first name out loud, and she had not decided to do it. It had simply come out, the way things do when they have been true for a while, without your permission. Something crossed his face at the sound of it. He looked for just a moment, like a man who had been standing at the edge of something for a long time and had just decided to step. "I am not good with words," he said. "I never have been, but I'm asking you." He stopped, recollected himself, started again at a slower pace. "I would like to ask if you'd come to Archer County with me, if that is something you would consider." She thought about what she wanted to say, and found that all of it was too large for the room. "You sanded the edge of the wood box," she said. "You knew my knuckle was catching on it." He said nothing. "You patched the roof in January. In the cold, the leak was. It was not an easy fix," she said. "No, it wasn't." He was quiet. "I have been afraid," she said, "of wanting something I couldn't keep. I've been afraid of it for a long time." She looked at her hands on the counter. "I am still afraid of it." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to stop being afraid." She looked at him. "I'm just asking you to come anyway," he said. The lamp held its small bright circle in the dark room. Somewhere in the station a door closed. The wind moved through the spaces between the planks the way it always had. But the room felt, to Ruth, entirely different from the room it had been before he'd spoken. She took a breath. "Yes," she said. They left the Hargrove Station on the 14th of May, when the sweet peas her mother would have planted were just about to bloom in a garden Ruth would never see. The stage went south, and they rode without speaking for a long while, which was all right between them now, perhaps the most all right it had ever been. At some point, somewhere south of the last town, he reached across and put his hand over hers where it rested on the seat between them. He didn't look at her when he did it. He just put his hand there. She turned her hand over and held his. They rode like that into the afternoon, into the opening country, into whatever came next. She had come to the Hargrove Station like a leaf blown against a fence post. She left it with a direction. She left it seen. In Archer County, the house on the northwest section of the Boone operation sat back from the road in a stand of cedar that broke the worst of the wind. The second spring they were there, Ruth planted sweet peas along the south-facing wall. She didn't tell Cass why she'd chosen that particular flower, and he didn't ask, but he built her a trellis for them before the seeds were even in the ground. Fitted boards and wire, made square and true, sunk deep enough to last. It lasted.